Hello, European history students. Today we're going to be continuing with the end of the Cold War and talking about the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We already talked about the dissolution of Eastern Europe, or the way that Eastern Europe got rid of communism, moved to a free market and to democracy. I talked to you a little bit about how glasnost and perestroika, these ideas of Mikhail Gorbachev, allowed Eastern Europe to have the freedom to break away from the Soviet Union. Today is really about glasnost, perestroika, and Gorbachev, and then the way that this affects the Soviet Union. Also getting rid of communism and moving towards, I almost said democracy, but that's silly. Check this out. Pretty cool, huh? Let's move on. First of all, Gorbachev is a new leader around 1985. He is of a different generation. The Soviet leaders before that were of the World War II generation. There's a bunch of old guys. You might remember Khrushchev or Brezhnev. Then there were two or three other guys who died in pretty quick succession in the early 80s. Gorbachev takes over. He's got some new ideas. He realizes that people in the Soviet Union wanted more. They wanted more consumer goods. They wanted a better economy. And Gorbachev knew that they needed a better economy in order to compete with the West, both in terms of keeping people happy, but then also in terms of militarily keeping up with the West. And so Gorbachev comes up with this idea of changing things. He tries restructuring the economy, perestroika, and then he also tries openness, political openness, or almost like a move towards more democratic functions or more democratic institutions, this thing called glasnost. Perestroika, as I said, is all about economic restructuring. It's really a decentralization of economic decision-making. Once again, if I was going to do a kind of contextualization with this, I'd maybe talk about the Gosplan or 4 or 5 year plans that the Soviet Union underwent, or talk about the NEP, or collectivization and industrialization under Stalin. But this decentralization of economic decision-making is trying to give more autonomy to individual factories, to individual collective farms. It's a kind of partial invisible hand. Let people, not in some bureaucracy, make the decisions for everything, but let people who are in sort of the front lines of the economy make some decisions. It doesn't really work very well. Freeing up people who had never had autonomy to make these economic decisions doesn't really do very much. People don't really have individual initiative in a communist kind of economy. Once again, there's that joke where the workers pretend to work and the state pretends to pay them, and then there really isn't very much for them to buy when they get to the stores. So perestroika doesn't really work very well. Glasnost is openness or publicity of problems. I use the term democracy or democratic because it's trying to get more people involved in allowing their voices to be heard. They're trying to get the educated elite a voice in fixing problems or a voice in reform. But really what it turns into, and you can imagine this, is criticism. And oftentimes not just by the people who know something. It's sadly people who don't know anything and are just, criticizing just to be critics. Gorbachev is really very popular outside of the Soviet Union. He is the first Soviet premier to really be popular, to really try to engage with people outside of the Soviet Union. And when he comes in, President Reagan has been in office for a few years, and Reagan is very much the Cold Warrior, using a lot of anti-Soviet, anti-communist rhetoric. Gorbachev comes in and doesn't say things like Khrushchev did, "We will bury you." Gorbachev makes peace overtures to the West. He, eventually meets with President Reagan, and together they decide to reduce the nuclear arsenals. Once again, the nuclear arsenals had far more warheads that the world would ever possibly need in order to destroy itself over several hundred times. And so, by making these peace overtures to the West, reducing nuclear tension, a kind of renewed détente, if you want to call it that, it really helps people in the West appreciate Gorbachev. In fact, when he travels outside of the Soviet Union, goes to Britain, goes to the United States, goes to Minnesota. In fact, he spent some time here in the Twin Cities. You might want to look that up, Google it. There is a newscast from when he came to Minnesota and visited the governor. I think that was in 1989, but I can't really remember. But the crowds of people outside of the Soviet Union give him this cute nickname, Gorby, and kind of chant, Gorby, Gorby, wherever he goes. He stops, he gets out of his black limousine, he shakes people's hands. He has this wife who you can see there a picture of her. She is very popular too. She's smiling. They're both smiling. They're both charming. Very different from Brezhnev. Very, very different from any other Soviet leader. Another thing that Gorbachev does, which makes him popular, is you might remember that there was an invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union in 1979. Well, this turned into kind of a desert Vietnam, so to speak, for the Soviet Union, with a lot of soldiers being killed and really not very much success coming the Soviets' way. And so Gorbachev decides to pull troops out of Afghanistan, and that makes him popular within the Soviet Union, of course. Young Soviet men are not going off to be killed in Afghanistan, but then also around the world. Getting rid of that kind of sort of imperialistic communism makes people feel a little bit better about the Soviet Union. He also then lets Eastern Europe know that the Brezhnev doctrine is kind of off the table, that he's not going to prop up their regimes by invading if another Prague 1968 or Hungary 1956 or East Germany 1953 kind of thing happened. He lets people know that they have to kind of work things out in their own Eastern European country in their own way. And like I said, this is really what leads to unraveling of communism in Eastern Europe. So from 1985 to 1988, people were kind of excited about perestroika and glasnost. There was, as you can imagine, a bit of rising food and consumer good production. They're trying to concentrate on that kind of thing, but it isn't enough. There are still lines. People are still, not satisfied with the goods available to them with the money that they make. And two, with glasnost, with publicity, with the ability to criticize, there is just generally less fear. And so, Gorbachev himself is criticizing the errors of the past. Well, at some point in time, people were doing that too, but at some point in time, people say, well, things aren't getting better after 3 years, and they start to criticize Gorbachev. Just like in Eastern Europe, there were elections that were semi-free in 1989, and the elections bring non-communists into the government or into the parliament. And one of the people who comes out of this is a man by the name of Boris Yeltsin. In fact, he is elected to be president of the Russian Republic in June of 1991. You can see by the map there that the Russian Republic, this big pink part of the Soviet Union, really is, I don't know, I'm guessing about 50% or 60% of the land mass of the Soviet Union. It's really quite important. It's really quite populous in the western part. And so by Boris Yeltsin being the leader of, this very important part of the Soviet Union, he becomes a kind of rival and then also a critic of Gorbachev. The two of them are at odds with one another to some extent, with Yeltsin being the anti-communist and Boris Yeltsin being the communist. In 1991, also, Marxism-Leninism and the planned economy, this is kind of like perestroika on steroids, if you will, was scrapped. It was dropped as the official philosophy of the Soviet Union and becomes a free market. You kind of start to wonder, well, what's left of communism? If there is a free market system in 1991, if there is more or less, democracy or semi-democracy going back to 1989, what's left of the dictatorial socialist or communist state known as the Soviet Union? There's Boris Yeltsin. This is after he gets into power. Sorry for the spoiler. Boris Yeltsin liked to drink, and sometimes he would go to functions where he would be a little bit tanked up. This is one where he is dancing. It's actually really quite funny. You can Google this if you want to. Just Google Boris Yeltsin dancing. You can see this concert and the way that he dances. Good times. Well, I think something that I really haven't talked too much about is, and even going back to the Russian Empire and Stalinist period and that kind of stuff, is that the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire were just filled with all kinds of different nationalities. True, there were lots and lots of Russians, Ukrainians, and White Russians, and so on. But there are lots of different kinds of nationalities, and they have different religions, and they have different likes and dislikes for each other. In 1988, there was some fighting breaking out between two different groups of people in the Caucasus region. These are Armenians, you might remember Armenians from World War One, and the Azerbaijanis. There was a bit of irredentism, as you can see from the map there, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where these two groups of people are fighting each other, and the Soviet Union just kind of lets them do their thing. They just kind of let them kill each other, which is kind of surprising in a state, any credible state has control over all the violence of all the force within its borders, but they were just letting that nationalism or that nationalistic rivalry and conflict go on. In spring of 1990, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all demanded autonomy from the Soviet Union. Now, this is really kind of a sticky situation because one of the things that Stalin did when he took over the Baltic states, exactly 50 years before that, was to repopulate it or settle ethnic Russians in all of those states. And if the Baltic states were given autonomy, if they in fact eventually got independence, there would be a lot of ethnic Russians who were sort of stuck in those places. They used to be in charge, and now they are a minority in those places. So this was a bit of a sticky situation, and also that twice the Soviet army had taken these Baltic states and made them a part of the Soviet Union. The army was really kind of loath to give up these places as well for the sacrifices that they made in getting them, especially the second time, not so much the first time. Well, it seems like the Soviet Union is starting to unravel. It seems like communism is going by the wayside. It seems like Gorbachev is weak. And in August of 1991, there was a putsch or an overthrow or an attempted overthrow of the reforms and of Gorbachev himself. Gorbachev was on vacation in Crimea at a vacation house. His house was surrounded by army troops, and communications were cut off between Gorbachev and the rest of the government. And then army troops moved into major cities. There was a group of generals and high-ranking military officers who decided that they wanted to save communism by overthrowing Gorbachev and moving their troops into cities to kind of just hold power and see if they could turn the clock back and make the Soviet Union again. What happened, though, was really quite striking. A bunch of little old ladies, little old grandmas, babushkas, moved out of their houses and into the streets and walked right up to the tanks and the armored personnel carriers and kind of, banged on them and asked the soldiers who were riding in these armored vehicles if they knew what their mothers, or if their mothers knew what they were doing. They were trying to shame these guys into admitting that they knew that they were part of a coup. And these soldiers said, well, no, we don't really know what we're doing. We're just ordered to sort of seize the streets and wait for further orders. And then they realized that they are part of a coup against Gorbachev or against the lawful government done by a bunch of military guys. Here's some pictures of that. You can see some civilians on top of military vehicles there on the right, and also talking to or fraternizing with the soldiers. For somebody who's trying to take over a place, you need to make sure that doesn't happen, because as soon as the people on the streets become people and not just targets to be shot at, soldiers really have a hard time shooting at people. Well, this is the hour of Yeltsin. These plotters were very focused on taking control of and holding Gorbachev, but they forgot to get a hold of Yeltsin. And Yeltsin goes out on the street, kind of like those little old grandmothers did, and he organizes resistance to this coup. He walks up to the tanks, gets on top of the tanks, and he says to the guys in the tanks, "You're Russian, right? Well, I'm the president of Russia, so you're part of an illegal coup. Stop listening to those generals who are ordering you around. Start listening to me." And the guys in the tank say, you got it. You're our guy. And so the army will not shoot at the demonstrators. The army is on the side of the people. And the coup collapses really pretty quickly. Yeltsin then forces Gorbachev to ban the Communist Party. He says, look, the Communist Party was where these generals were coming from and wanted to return to a monopoly of communist control. You got to get rid of the Communist Party. Gorbachev does that. And then there's just nothing left of the Soviet Union, if you think about it. Leninism, Marxism as an economic policy, a one-party state has been done away with. There's Yeltsin at his finest hour, standing on top of a tank talking to a soldier, and you can see there's a babushka, a little old lady bringing food or something to the soldiers on that tank or armored personnel carrier. And once again, if you are, I should do it this way. If you are ever occupied by soldiers, then you need to go up to those soldiers and make yourself a human being to them so that they don't run you over and shoot you. Just good advice from European history. Well, the Soviet Union unravels. Yeltsin eclipsed Gorbachev both in popularity and in power as a Russian president, and Gorbachev kind of does what the communist officials in Eastern Europe did. He just kind of resigns. And one by one, the 15 republics, the Soviet Socialist republics, declared independence from the Soviet Union. They were feeling nationalism. They didn't want, communism that had ruled them for so long. They wanted nationalism. And so a lot of these states become independent. Upon a little bit of reflection, the three largest states, most populous states, and most powerful states, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, formed a commonwealth of independent states for a short period of time. Later, that kind of splits apart as well, and they become independent states. So the Soviet Union, as we've seen it, existed from 1917 to 1991, and it was an attempt at a kind of Marxist or communist state, but it never really gets there, does it? It doesn't really follow what Karl Marx said would happen, and it doesn't even happen in a place where it seems that that would be likely. What it becomes, or what it was a socialist dictatorship where they're trying to take care of the people in very socialistic ways. They're trying to create a kind of workers' paradise. They're trying to industrialize. They're trying to create a place where the hammer and the sickle, or the factory worker and the farmer would be taken care of and be healthy and all that kind of stuff. But there's also a dictatorship. They have to force people to live like this. And oftentimes, under Stalin, for example, it becomes a horrible dictatorship with millions of people being killed. It does, though, create Russia as a modern superpower. For the Cold War, it seemed like a very worthy adversary of the West and very powerful with nuclear weapons and huge numbers of troops and so on. But in the end, what dooms it is people wanting more freedom, people wanting more comfort, people wanting a better standard of living. And some of that freedom included things like nationalist aspirations. They didn't want to belong to a large empire. These states had their own culture, their own languages, their own religious beliefs, and they wanted to be separate from one another. And so the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire simply disintegrates. Yeltsin, as president of Russia, now we're just dealing with Russia, more or less at this point in time, is kind of an interesting thing that happens. He is in power from 1992 to the year 2000. He himself is kind of declining over that period of time. As I said, he really liked to drink. He's probably an alcoholic, and his health isn't great. Something crazy happens in 1993. It kind of makes sense, though. There's a lot of ex-communists in the Russian parliament. They don't want to give Yeltsin too much power. Yeltsin wants power. And just like we've seen through European history many times, there is a fight between the leader and the parliament. This turns into, actually, Yeltsin ordering tanks to attack the parliament building and fire their cannons into the parliament building. The parliament building was burning. It was really quite dramatic to see. You could watch it all live on CNN back when CNN was a news channel that people watched a lot. In addition to that, there's a place called Chechnya, which is also in the Caucasus region, and it was a part of the Soviet Union that was Muslim. It was a kind of Islamic state that tried to break away from the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, or say Russia now, doesn't want them to break away because it's filled with oil. And what you have happening then is Chechen terrorism against Russia, and Russia invading Chechnya and basically destroying the capital Grozny and killing lots of people, and just a continued fight between Chechen guerrillas or Chechen terrorists / freedom fighters, depends on which side you're on, fighting against Russians. This still happens today from time to time, where Chechen people will blow up something in Moscow, or there was a very horrible takeover of a school that Chechen fighters did, and when the Russian special forces tried to free all of the kids and teachers and parents and so on at the school, it was an absolute bloodbath, and hundreds of people died. In addition to that, as communism goes away, as the planned economy goes away, it allows for all of these state-run enterprises to be sold to investors or sold to people. And the people who bought them up for very cheap prices become these so-called oligarchs, people who become crazy rich from the dismantling of communism, the old state-run factories and everything. Here you can see the White House. The White House is the Russian Parliament building, and it's burning. Sadly, you can't see the tanks that are just outside of the Parliament building firing into it. That was kind of crazy. You can see on the right images from Chechnya. You can see destroyed buildings in the capital city of Grozny. I'm not really sure what's going on there, but it looks like there's some active fighting going on in a kind of state, actually firing guns. Well, Yeltsin fades, and at the end of 1999, he turns power over to a guy by the name of Vladimir Putin. Putin is a strongman, ex-KGB officer, and he comes into power and he wants to more or less create a Russia which is kind of like the old Soviet Union, very powerful, very nationalistic, um, and it's filled with strength and vim and vigor. And so he renews the war in Chechnya and conquers the Chechens and tries to keep them under control. He also increases the government control and centralization once again. He wants to have the kind of control that in some ways might remind you of what the czars had back in the day, where the leader is popular and the leader is making decisions and doesn't have to listen to a parliament or doesn't have to listen to anyone else. It's kind of a return to the autocracy that I guess never really went away in Russia or the Soviet Union. Putin combats oligarchs, super rich guys who are not on his side. He says that he's combating crime and corruption. Oftentimes, though, he is in some ways behind the corruption himself, and oftentimes gets rid of people in the media who are his critics or dissidents or people who are against him. He doesn't shrink from doing things like poisoning them and assassinating them. Remember that he is an ex-KGB officer, so he's familiar with all of these kinds of nasty. Russia becomes rich for any period of time that the price of natural resources, especially oil and natural gas, is high. They lose a lot of revenue when natural resources, the prices of natural resources are low. They don't really sell very many things to people in the West. You never read "made in Russia" on anything that you're buying, but the Russians do have these natural resources that they can sell and make. In general, though, sadly, there is a decline in social welfare. There's a decline in the education system, and in fact, even a decline in life expectancy, and even a dramatic decline in births per family or per woman, to the point where the Russians were trying to pay people to have children, and I can't remember what the payment was. It was something like about $10,000 for somebody having a baby. Well, it seems like Putin is kind of going along with a resurgent Russian nationalism, trying to regain an empire and fooling around with taking over Crimea, for example, because it tugs on the heartstrings of Russians, or even getting involved in American politics and that sort of thing. Just sort of always messing around and trying to project its power. Look at what they're doing in Syria and in getting engaged in the Syrian civil war and pushing forward, a Russian military presence in the Middle East. So all of this stuff is happening under Putin. Here's my Putin page. It used to be a lot funnier before before Putin has revealed himself to be a really pretty bad guy. But there are some pictures of him. There's kind of the beefcake photos of Putin without a shirt on, and Putin riding on a horse, and Putin fishing, and Putin hunting, and Putin doing judo, and all kinds of stuff like that. And then, of course, he does kind of have that KGB look about him as well. So to kind of tie things up with Russia for the year, Russia was a large and powerful state that plays a huge role in European history. It is, based on its size, it's going to always just play a very large role in world history, I think, and the number of people that it has. It's got almost 200 million or so people in Russia, and so it's just a large and powerful state. Always has seemed to be, and seems to continue to be, a little bit different from Western Europe, a little bit more authoritarian. And I think it'll be really interesting to find out what happens going forward in the future. What's going to happen with Russia? It's really hard to predict, but you'll be able to watch that. And hopefully what you've learned about Russia during this year will give you some sort of insight or background insight into things going forward. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you could please just go ahead and do reading. I don't think the reading today has anything to do with Russia per se, but do the reading quiz. Hopefully you took notes on this, all the stuff on the. Have a great day. Bye bye.